The well had not run dry, and that single mercy was the only reason Emmett Rhodes had not put a bullet in the ground and walked away from everything he had ever loved. The summer of 1886 came to the Texas Panhandle like a slow-burning fire, creeping across the plains with a patience that felt almost deliberate, almost cruel, as though the land itself had grown tired of the men and women who scratched at its surface and demanded grain and cattle and cotton in return for their sweat. The sky turned white before noon every day, a bleached and merciless expanse that offered no shade and no promise of rain, and the earth below it cracked open in long, reaching lines like the palms of 1,000 dried-out hands. The buffalo grass turned to straw. The creek that ran along the eastern edge of Emmett's property shrank to a trickle, then to a string of mud-dark pools, then to nothing at all by the middle of June. Emmett was 31 years old, and had spent 11 of those years building something on 420 acres of Panhandle soil. He had started with a one-room dugout and a borrowed mule, had added a proper timber frame house in his 4th year when the cattle prices were good, had strung fence posts with his own hands across every acre he owned. His herd had numbered 216 head of longhorn cattle in the spring of 1885. By August of 1886, he had 37 left, and those 37 were gaunt and hollow-eyed, their ribs pressing through their hides like the slats of a barrel that had been left too long in the sun. His neighbor, Chester Boyle, had sold out in May and headed for Missouri. His other neighbor, a widow named Ruth Garza, had packed her 3 children into a wagon in early June and gone to stay with a cousin in San Antonio. The town of Caldwell's Fork, 7 miles to the east, had shed 1/3 of its population since spring, and the general store had closed 2 of its 4 supply lines because the railroad freight was costing more than anyone in the county could afford to pay. Emmett had stayed. He stayed because his father's bones were in the ground on the northwest corner of the property, beneath a white-painted cedar cross that his mother had made before she too had passed, 4 years after his father, from a fever that the county doctor had no medicine to cure. He stayed because the well was still good, still cold and sweet, and 40 feet deep, pulling up water from a place the drought had not yet found. He stayed because leaving felt like dying, and dying at least meant he would rest in familiar soil. He drew water from the well each morning before the sun was fully up, carrying it in 2 oak buckets to the trough where his horses drank, and then he would stand in the yard and look at the land that was his and try to find some purchase in his chest, some small handhold of hope that would keep him from going completely hollow. He found less and less of it as July wore on. It was on a Wednesday morning, the 4th day of August in 1886, that he first saw the wagon coming down the main track from the northeast. He was mending a section of fence on the near side of his property, or trying to, working the pliers with hands that were cracked and stiff from the dry heat. The wagon was a single-horse rig, a modest buckboard with a canvas cover strung between 2 bent hickory bows, and it was moving at a pace that suggested either the horse was tired or the driver had no particular urgency about arriving anywhere quickly. He watched it for a moment, then went back to the fence wire. Travelers came through on that track occasionally, heading for Caldwell's Fork or cutting across toward the railroad depot at Tascosa. He had no cause to pay it special mind. But the wagon stopped at his gate. He set down the pliers and straightened up, pressing the flat of his hand against the small of his back where a persistent ache had taken up residence sometime in June and had not seen fit to leave. He walked toward the gate, squinting against the white light. The woman on the buckboard seat was perhaps 26 or 27, with dark auburn hair pinned up beneath a wide-brimmed straw hat that had seen better days and was now somewhat crooked on her head, as though it had endured the same long journey she had. She had green eyes, the kind of green that reminded Emmett of creek water before the drought, when it had still run clear over smooth stones and the light had played through it in the late afternoon. She was dressed practically, in a dark cotton skirt and a cream-colored shirtwaist with the sleeves rolled to the elbows. And there was dust on everything. Dust on her hat and her shoulders and the backs of her hands. The same fine reddish panhandle dust that covered everything Emmett owned. In the bed of the wagon behind her, he could see crates. Wooden crates and burlap sacks, stacked with care and covered partly by the canvas and partly by a piece of oilcloth that had been tied down at the corners. "Excuse me," she said, and her voice was clear and direct, not uncertain the way he might have expected a woman alone on the road to sound. "Is this the Rhodes property? Emmett Rhodes?" He stopped with his hands on the top rail of the gate. "It is." "Then I've found the right place." She set the brake on the wagon and climbed down from the seat with the practiced ease of someone who had been doing it all day, and probably for several days before that. She came to the gate and extended her hand, and he shook it because there was nothing else to do. Her grip was firm and her palm was calloused. "My name is Hazel Aldridge. I'm from Abilene. I was told to find Emmett Rhodes by a man named William Pryor, who runs the land agency out of Caldwell's Fork." Emmett knew William Pryor. William Pryor was the man who had written to him twice in the past 3 months asking if he wished to sell his land for a price that was slightly more insulting each time. "What business do you have with William Pryor?" he asked, and he heard the edge in his own voice and did not try to sand it off. "The agency lists property in the county," Hazel said evenly. "I went to him because I need land. Specifically, I need land with water. He mentioned your well." She met his eyes without hesitation. "I'm not here to buy your land, Mr. Rhodes. I want to propose an arrangement. I have seeds, you have water, and as far as I can see, this part of Texas needs both." He stared at her for a moment that stretched out longer than was polite. "Seeds," he said. "Yes." She turned and went to the wagon, climbing up into the bed with a nimble ease and pulling back a corner of the oilcloth to reveal one of the crates. She pried it open with a short crowbar and showed him what was inside. Small cloth bags, dozens of them, each tied with string and labeled in a careful hand. Sorghum, milo, black-eyed peas, drought cowpeas, watermelon, winter squash, turnip, sweet potato slips bundled in damp moss. And in a separate, smaller box lined with straw glass jars sealed with wax that contained what she explained were seeds for a variety of Mennonite hard red winter wheat she had obtained from a community of German-Russian settlers in central Kansas. "This wheat," she said, holding up one of the jars, "was bred in the Russian steppes. It survives drought conditions that would kill an ordinary winter wheat crop. It goes into the ground in October. By June it gives you grain." Emmett looked at the jar. He looked at the woman holding it. He looked at the cracked earth of his own field spreading away behind him in the white morning light. "You came from Abilene with a wagon full of seeds," he said. "I did. Alone. My brother drove me as far as Crosby County and then had to turn back. His family needed him." She said it simply, without any invitation to pity. "I managed the rest." "How far is that from here?" "About 4 days at the pace I was keeping." Emmett took his hat off and ran his hand through his hair and put his hat back on. "Miss Aldridge, this land is 8 years into a drought that is killing every farm and ranch in the Panhandle. What makes you think seeds are the answer to that?" "Water is the answer," she said immediately. "Seeds are the other half of the answer. And you have water." She looked past him toward the well, which was visible from the gate, its wooden housing standing slightly crooked in the yard, the rope and bucket hanging still in the airless heat. "I know a great deal about dryland farming, Mr. Rhodes. I spent 3 years working alongside a man named Cyrus Henderson in Abilene who had made a study of it. I know which crops need the least moisture per acre, which ones build the soil back instead of stripping it, and which ones can be sown in sequence so that the ground is never fully bare. I am not here with fantasies. I am here with plans that have worked." He was quiet for a moment. The horse on the wagon shifted its weight and blew through its nose. "What exactly is the arrangement you are proposing?" he said. Hazel Aldridge looked at him with her green eyes steady and her voice completely level. "I need a place to work. You need the land to produce again. I have no money to buy property and no credit to borrow it." But I have knowledge and I have these seeds and I am willing to work harder than anyone you have ever hired. I'll pay my way with labor." She paused. "I'm also a fair cook and I can mend a harness if that matters." Something moved in Emmett's chest that he had not felt in a long time. It was not quite hope, not yet. It was something more cautious than that, more tentative, like the first green thing pushing up through cracked earth before you were sure whether another frost might come. He did not know what to do with it, so he looked at the ground and then at the sky and then at her. "You can sleep in the house," he said finally. "I'll take the barn. It's not proper otherwise." A faint color moved across her cheeks, and he thought it might have been the beginning of a smile, though she kept her expression composed. "That's very decent of you, Mr. Rhodes." "You'd best call me Emmett," he said, unlatching the gate. "If you're going to be working my land, Mr. Rhodes sounds like I'm the one owing you money." She smiled then, fully, and it rearranged everything in her face. He helped her bring the wagon through the gate and unhitch the horse, a dun mare named Scylla, which Hazel told him with the matter-of-fact affection of someone who had been talking to the horse for 4 days of solitary road. He put Scylla in the corral with his 2 remaining horses and forked some of the precious hay he had been rationing carefully. He showed Hazel the house. It was not much to look at from the outside. A timber-frame structure with a narrow porch, 2 windows in front and 1 on each side, a stone chimney that had developed a lean to the east. Inside it was clean, because Emmett had always been a man who kept his spaces ordered even when everything outside them was falling apart. And there were 2 rooms, a main room that served as kitchen and sitting area, and a back room with a rope bed, and a mattress stuffed with corn husks that had seen better days. There was a wood stove and a cast-iron cook-pot, and a Dutch oven and a good supply of dried beans, and some salted pork that he had been stretching carefully. And there were 2 chairs at the table that had come from his parents' house in the wagon they had driven from Missouri when Emmett was 8 years old. Hazel stood in the main room and looked around it the way a woman looks at a place when she is quietly assessing whether she can make it work. Then she nodded once, as though she had had a conversation with herself and reached a satisfactory conclusion. "Tell me about the soil," she said. "All of it. What you had growing before and where, what failed first, how the water table sits." So he told her. He sat at the table with a cup of coffee that he made thin because coffee was running low and likely to stay that way, and she sat across from him with a small notebook she had taken from a bag, and she wrote things down while he talked. He told her about the winter wheat he had grown in the north fields that had given him good harvests for 4 years running before the drought broke it. He told her about the kitchen garden his mother had planted that had gone to dust. He told her about the creek and where it had run, and what the soil was like along its banks compared to the harder, rockier ground near the southwest corner, where the land sloped up slightly toward a low ridge. She asked questions that surprised him with their precision. She asked about the depth of topsoil in the low-lying sections. She asked whether the cracking pattern of the dry earth was consistent or whether it varied, because consistent cracking could mean clay-heavy subsoil that would hold moisture longer once it was reintroduced. She asked which direction the prevailing wind came from in winter and how deep the frost penetrated in January. He answered everything he knew, and when he did not know something, he said so, and she wrote that down too as a question to investigate. By the time the sun had tipped past noon and the heat inside the house had become something close to physical, he realized he had been talking for 2 hours and had not once thought about the 37 cattle or the empty creek bed or the price of hay from the railhead at Amarillo. He noticed this the way you notice a pain that has stopped, with a small, disoriented wonder. "You should rest," he said. "You've been on the road 4 days." "I'll rest when I've seen the well," she said. He took her to the well. She lowered the bucket and listened to it hit the water below, and the sound of it, that cool, liquid thump in the deep dark, seemed to affect her the way it still sometimes affected him, with something like reverence. She pulled the bucket up and tasted the water from her cupped palm. "It's good," she said quietly. "Yes," he said. "It's the only thing that is." She looked at him then with something in her eyes that was not pity, because he could tell she was not a woman who traded in pity. It was something more considered than that, something closer to recognition, as though she understood what it meant to have one good thing left and to have built your entire remaining life around the fact of it. "Then we start here," she said, and she placed her palm flat on the wooden housing of the well, and for a moment she just stood there with her eyes closed and the hot wind moving a strand of auburn hair across her cheek, and Emmett Rhodes stood beside her and felt the tentative, cautious thing in his chest grow just slightly larger. The first week was practical and exhausting and left neither of them with much energy for conversation beyond what was necessary. Hazel drew up a plan for the fields in her notebook, dividing Emmett's acreage into sections based on soil type and water access, and what she called microclimate zones, the places where the land dipped slightly and held the morning coolness a little longer, the spots where the rock formation beneath the surface kept the temperature of the ground more stable. She explained every decision to him, not because she thought he was ignorant, but because, she told him directly, she had found that two people understood a plan better than one, and better understanding meant fewer mistakes. He liked that about her. He liked that she did not speak around things or make him guess at her meaning. He had known women in his life who had treated directness as a flaw, who had dressed their thoughts in so many layers of softening language that, by the time you found the actual meaning, it had been somewhat changed by the journey. Hazel Aldridge said what she meant and meant what she said, and there was a relief in it that he had not expected. They began hauling water from the well on the second day. Emmett had a wooden sled he used to move heavy things, and he fitted it with 4 large barrels that he sealed as best he could with pitch, and twice a day in the cooler hours they drove this contraption to the well, filled the barrels by hand bucket, and then drew the sled by horse to whichever section of ground Hazel had designated for preparation. The soil work was slow and careful. She showed him how she wanted the earth turned, not the deep plowing that stripped the exposed subsoil to the weather, but a shallower, more deliberate process that preserved the little biological material remaining in the top few inches. She mixed in a composting material she had been accumulating in a barrel during her journey, dried plant matter and manure and wood ash, and she worked it into the turned soil by hand, section by section, with a patience that Emmett found almost incomprehensible given the scale of what they were trying to do. On the 4th evening after her arrival, he was sitting on the porch step in the cooling dusk, and she came and sat beside him. Not too close, but close enough that he was aware of her presence the way he was aware of the well as something certain in the landscape. "You're wondering if it will work," she said. "I'm always wondering that." "So am I," she said, which surprised him. "But wondering hasn't stopped me yet." He glanced at her sideways. "Why did you come? All the way from Abilene alone with a wagon full of seeds. Most people are leaving this country, not coming into it." She was quiet for a moment. The last light was going off the land in shades of copper and deep rose, and the air had that particular quality of a Panhandle evening, warm still but with a hint of something cooler moving under it from the north, just enough to make you grateful. "I had a farm in Abilene," she said, "with my father. He died 2 years ago and left it to my brother, which is how things are done." She said the last part without bitterness, just acknowledgement. "I couldn't stay on as a dependent. I'm not built for it. And I had been learning everything I could about soil and seeds and dryland farming for years, because I always understood that this part of the country needed someone to figure out how to survive in it properly, not just fight the land but actually learn to live with what the land is. And you thought Texas needed that lesson more than most. I thought I needed to be the one to bring it," she said. "There's a difference." He looked at her for a long moment. The evening light was kind on her face, softening the tiredness around her eyes without erasing the strength beneath them. "I think you might be the most determined woman I have ever encountered," he said. She smiled, and it was different from her earlier smiles, quieter, more private. "I think you might be the most stubborn man who ever refused to leave a dying farm." "It's not dying," he said, and was surprised to find that he half believed it now. No, she agreed. Not anymore. They sat in the evening for a while longer, not speaking, and it was the kind of silence that is comfortable rather than empty, the kind that two people arrive at after they have found a preliminary trust in each other and no longer need words to fill the space between them. The black-eyed peas went in first. Hazel had chosen a plot on the eastern side of the property where the soil was lighter and the morning sun would hit it fully, and she sowed them in the way her Kansas mentors had taught her, in wide, shallow furrows with careful spacing to allow the root system's room to spread without competing. She watered them by hand from the barrel sled, measuring the water with a careful eye, enough to reach the seed depth and no more, because waste was the enemy of the whole enterprise. Emmett watched her work, and then he worked alongside her, and gradually he stopped watching and simply worked, because she had a way of explaining things that made you want to be part of what she was building rather than merely an observer of it. She talked while she worked, which he had not initially expected from her, though he supposed he should have. She talked about soil biology and the way legumes fixed nitrogen and gave back to the ground as they grew. She talked about the German-Russian Mennonite farmers in Kansas who had brought their wheat and their farming knowledge from the Crimean steppes and had built a kind of agriculture in the Kansas plains that the American farmers around them had initially dismissed and later frantically tried to imitate. She talked about water endlessly, about its movement through soil and its storage in clay layers and the angle of a good well casing. He told her things in return. He told her about the cattle business and how the open range was changing, about the big outfits from the east fencing in land that the smaller ranchers had always used for grazing, about the way the cattle market had collapsed after the harsh winter of 1885 had killed hundreds of thousands of head across the whole southern plains. He told her about the town of Caldwell's Fork and the people who had left it and the ones who had stayed, and he found as he talked that he was giving her the texture of the place and the people in a way he had not done for anyone in a very long time, because there had been no one to tell. At the end of the second week, the first black-eyed pea shoots came up. They were pale and small and improbably fragile-looking, pushing through the cracked crust of the earth like something that had no business being optimistic about its circumstances. Hazel was in the field when they appeared, and she called to Emmett, and he came at a jog from the well where he had been drawing the morning water, and he stood beside her and looked at the shoots coming out of the earth, and felt the thing in his chest expand again, this time unmistakably, into something that could finally be called hope. Hazel crouched down and touched one of the shoots very lightly with her fingertip, the way you touch something you are afraid might dissolve if you press too hard. "There it is," she said very quietly. "There it is," Emmett said, and his voice had gone slightly rough in a way that embarrassed him and that he made no effort to conceal. She looked up at him from her crouched position, and the morning light was full on her face and the green of her eyes was very bright, and something passed between them that was not yet spoken and that neither of them reached for, but that was as present and undeniable as the shoots coming up from the drought-cracked soil. They went to Caldwell's Fork on a Saturday in the third week of August, because Emmett needed supplies and also because Hazel had written letters during the evenings that she wanted to post, correspondence with seed suppliers, and with the county agricultural office in Amarillo, and with a botanist she had met through Cyrus Henderson in Abilene who was studying soil restoration techniques. The town of Caldwell's Fork was a diminished thing by that summer. 3 of the businesses on the main street had closed, their windows papered over or simply dark and empty. The livery was still operating, and so was the saloon and the general store run by a man named August Friel, who was perhaps 60 years old, and had the look of a man who had decided long ago that he would outlast anything the world sent him, and had not yet been proven wrong. August Friel looked at Hazel Aldridge with the frank assessment of a man who had lived in small towns long enough to know that a stranger's arrival was either news or trouble, and that the difference was not always immediately apparent. "This is Miss Hazel Aldridge," Emmett said at the counter. "She's working my land." August Friel looked from Emmett to Hazel and back, with a long and clearly comprehensive thought occurring behind his eyes. "Working your land," he repeated. "Dryland farming methods," Hazel said pleasantly. "Seeds and soil preparation. I'm told you have difficulty getting flour here since the rail freight costs went up." "Difficult is the kindest word for it," August said. "Then perhaps in 6 months you will have local grain to work with," she said. "We're putting in winter wheat in October. Mennonite variety from Kansas. It can survive conditions that would kill anything else. If it takes, Mr. Rhodes will have a harvest and you will have a closer source." August Friel studied her for another moment, then his face did something that might have been the beginning of respect. "You sure about that, miss?" "I am not sure of anything in farming," she said honestly, "but I am very well prepared." Word moved through Caldwell's Fork the way words always move through small western towns, quickly and with embellishments, and by the time Emmett and Hazel were ready to leave, 2 other men had come into the store to speak to her. One was Jonas Whittaker, who had about 150 acres north of town and was barely holding on, and the other was a man named Domingo Reyes, a Mexican-American farmer whose family had worked land in the county since before it was a county, since the land had been something else entirely, before the American surveying lines had come across it with their indifferent geometries. Domingo Reyes's family had survived more upheaval than most people in Caldwell's Fork could imagine, had had land taken and disputed and whittled away by a legal system that had not been designed with their interests in mind, and he had what was left of it, and was holding it with a ferocity that Emmett had always respected from a distance. Hazel talked to both men with the same directness and courtesy she applied to everything, and she gave Jonas Whittaker a portion of her cowpea seeds wrapped in a cloth and told him where and how to plant them. And she told Domingo Reyes that she would be glad to visit his land if he wanted her to look at his soil conditions. And she said all of this with the natural authority of someone who understood that knowledge was not made smaller by sharing it. On the drive back in the wagon, the late afternoon light going golden and long across the empty flats, Emmett said, "You know you've just made yourself very popular with half the county." "Good," she said. "And very suspicious to the other half." "That's all right, too." She was looking out at the land with the particular attention she gave to everything in the landscape, reading it the way some people read a text. "Do you know what strikes me about this country?" "What's that?" "It's not broken. People keep saying that, and I understand why, but it isn't. The land has been farmed wrong for the conditions, and the drought has punished that, but the land itself is still here. The water is still here, underground. The biology isn't gone from the soil, just stressed." She paused. "The country isn't broken. The approach was." Emmett let this settle for a moment. He had lived here 11 years, and he had not once thought of it that way, because when you were in the middle of watching something fail, you tended to blame the thing that was failing rather than the method being applied to it. "You are," he said slowly, "either the wisest person who has come through this county in 10 years, or you are spectacularly wrong about all of it." She laughed then, a real laugh, full and sudden, the first he had heard from her, and it changed the whole character of the afternoon. "I know which one I am hoping for," she said. He was looking at the side of her face. The straw hat cast a long shadow across her cheek, and the evening light touched her throat and her hands where they held the reins, and Emmett Rhodes felt something shift in him with a slow, tectonic permanence, the way land shifts when it has been under pressure long enough, finally and irrevocably, into a new configuration. He did not say anything. It was too soon, and he was too unused to the feeling and too afraid that if he named it, it would prove as fragile as those first pea shoots, pushing up through cracked earth into an uncertain sky. But he sat beside her on the wagon seat and felt it, and the miles back to his property seemed both too short and exactly right. September came in with a wind change from the northwest that smelled faintly and electrifyingly of rain. It did not actually rain, not then, but the smell of it was enough to change the quality of the days, to make the heat feel less permanent. And Emmett noticed that both the horses and the remaining cattle lifted their heads more on those days, as though the promise of moisture was something they could taste from a distance. Hazel had settled into the property with a thoroughness that had stopped surprising him and started feeling natural. She rose before him every morning, and he would come out of the barn in the dawn dark to find the fire going in the house and coffee on, and Hazel already at the table with her notebook, working out the next sequence of the planting schedule. She had organized the seeds in the main room with a system of her own devising, small labeled drawers she had constructed from spare wood, and organized by planting time and water requirement, and what she called companion planting affinities, which crops did better growing near each other, and which ones competed. She had also begun to transform the kitchen garden that Emmett's mother had kept, using the space on the south side of the house where the wall reflected heat and the ground was sheltered from the north wind. She planted turnips and winter squash and the sweet potato slips she had kept alive in their damp moss for the entire journey, and she watered this garden with the gray water from cooking, carrying the pot out after every meal to pour carefully at the roots. Emmett built her a better watering system. He did it on a Sunday afternoon without announcing he was going to, cutting a wooden trough and running it from the corner of the house, where the roof would catch any rain that came, and fitting it with a stopcock he had fashioned from a length of pipe, salvaged from the collapsed outbuilding that had been Chester Boyle's corn crib, which Chester had left behind when he fled to Missouri. It was not a complex construction, but it was solid and well-made because Emmett built things to last, and when Hazel came around the side of the house and saw it, she stopped and looked at it for a full moment before she looked at him. "Emmett," she said. "It'll collect rain when it comes," he said. "Save you carrying gray water." "That is extraordinarily practical and extremely thoughtful," she said. He shrugged and looked at the ground. "It's just wood and pipe." "Nothing is ever just what it's made of," she said quietly, and there was something in her voice that made him look up, and when he did she was looking at him with the green eyes steady and warm, and the color that came to her cheeks when she was moved by something had come to her cheeks now, and he thought he had never in his life seen anything as lovely as her face in that afternoon light with the warmth in her eyes directed at him. "You should know," he said, and his voice came out lower than he intended, "that I am not a man who knows how to say things well. I'm better with my hands than my words." "I've noticed," she said softly. "I don't mind that. I'm just saying it so you know what you're working with." He heard himself and almost winced at the clumsiness of it, and then heard her laugh quietly, just a small sound, more breath than voice, and the warmth in it did something to the last of the walls he had been keeping up. "I think I have a fair idea of what I'm working with," she said, "and I'm not unhappy about it." He took a step toward her, not a large step, barely crossing the distance between them, and he said, "Miss Aldridge, Hazel, I want to be direct with you because I think you deserve that." She stood very still. "I find myself thinking about you when I ought to be thinking about other things," he said. "I don't know what you feel about this place or about staying, and I don't think it's fair of me to ask you that yet, because you've been here less than 2 months, and you have your own reasons for being here that have nothing to do with me. But I want you to know that I am aware of you in a way that is not just about the farm." He stopped. "That may have been the most awkward thing I have ever said to another person." Hazel Aldridge's composure had been holding all through this, composed and still and attentive, but now she smiled, and it was the private smile, the quiet one that he had been cataloging without realizing it. "It was perhaps not the most poetic declaration in the history of the Panhandle," she said, "but I think it might be the most honest, and I find that I respond better to honesty than to poetry." She looked at him steadily. "I have been thinking about you too, Emmett, in ways that I told myself were not appropriate given the arrangement and the circumstances. And I have not entirely succeeded in telling myself that." The distance between them was small, and the afternoon was golden, and the wooden trough he had built was there behind her, solid and plain and well-made. And Emmett thought that perhaps the best things in life were often that way, solid and plain and well-made, and that he had been alone long enough to know the difference between what was real and what was merely convenient. He reached out and took her hand, which was warm and calloused and entirely itself, and he held it, and she looked at their joined hands and then at him, and neither of them said anything more that afternoon, but it was the most that had happened on that property in a very long time. October came. The wheat went into the ground. It was an operation of scale that Emmett would not have believed possible 2 months earlier. Hazel had plotted out 40 acres of the north field for the winter wheat, the Mennonite hard red variety, and they prepared those 40 acres over the course of 3 weeks in September with the careful, methodical soil work she had been practicing since her arrival. They hauled water on the barrel sled every morning and evening. They turned the soil to precisely the depth she specified. They worked in the composted material she had been building in a series of wooden bins behind the barn, plant matter and manure, and the ash from the cook stove. Domingo Reyes came to help on the day they sowed the wheat. He arrived in the morning with his eldest son, a quiet and capable young man of about 20 named Raphael, and they worked alongside Emmett and Hazel through the long October day, walking the furrows with the seed drill Emmett had borrowed from the feed store in Caldwell's Fork, covering 40 acres in steady, measured passes. Jonas Whitaker sent his hired hand in the afternoon, and August Friel himself came out near the end of the day, which Emmett found quietly extraordinary, because August Friel was not a man known for physical labor. Hazel directed the whole operation with her notebook in one hand and her other hand free to demonstrate, moving up and down the field rows with the energy of someone who had been storing purpose for a long time and was finally being given full permission to spend it. She knew every person there within the first hour, knew their names and their land situations and their family compositions, and she treated each of them with the same respect and the same clear expectation that they were capable of doing what she needed them to do. Emmett watched her from the far end of a furrow row and felt something that was not quite proprietary because she was not his to be proprietary about, but was perhaps the early cousin of pride, the feeling of standing near someone who is remarkable and being glad to be near them. At the end of the day, with the 40 acres planted and the evening cooling fast, Hazel made a pot of beans and fried salt pork and cornbread in the Dutch oven, and they all ate together on the porch and in the yard, and the talk was the talk of people who have worked hard toward a common purpose and feel the satisfaction of it in their bodies. Domingo Reyes said, as he was leaving, "My grandfather would have liked you, Miss Aldridge. He was a man who believed the land could be read if you were willing to be quiet enough to hear it." Hazel said, "I would have very much liked to meet him." Domingo nodded with a gravity that held all the history his family had lived in this land, the Spanish colonial years and the years of the Republic of Texas and the years of statehood and all the shifting laws that had changed what could be owned and by whom. And he looked at the 40 acres of freshly planted wheat under the last light and he said, "I hope it grows." "It will grow," Hazel said, not with bravado, with the certainty of someone who has done the preparation and understood the science and still understands that the final piece is always faith. After everyone had gone and the dishes were done and Emmett was banking the fire in the cook stove for the night, Hazel came and stood in the doorway between the main room and the porch. "Thank you," she said, "for all of this, for letting me come here and not turning me away at the gate." He looked at her across the room. The lamp on the table made her face soft, and her hair had come partly down from its pins during the long day, and she had not repinned it, and she looked entirely herself, tired and warm and present. "You should know," he said carefully, "that the day you came to that gate was the first day in 6 months that I felt something other than the feeling that I was watching everything end." She was very still. "So thank you," he said, "for not accepting that everything had ended." Hazel crossed the room and stood before him and put her hand against his cheek, and it was the first time she had touched his face, and the warmth of her palm against his skin was something he would remember for a long time afterward. She looked at him with the green eyes very clear. It had not ended, she said. It was only waiting. He covered her hand with his, and the fire in the cook stove settled into its low and steady heat, and outside the October wind moved across the 40 acres of newly planted wheat and the pea field and the kitchen garden on the south side of the house. And the well stood in the dark yard, its water cold and sweet and 40 feet deep, having survived the worst the drought could do, still giving. November found them in a new kind of relationship that was neither declared nor undeclared, but was understood between them with the clarity of two people who know their own minds and are in no hurry to rush a thing that is growing at its natural pace. He had moved back into the house. It had not been a formal conversation, more of a gradual accommodation to the fact that the weather was turning and the barn was cold, and there were 2 rooms in the house, and a perfectly good standard of decency could be maintained, without one of them being uncomfortable. He slept in the back room, and she slept on the narrow cot he had built along the wall of the main room, and they treated this with a matter-of-fact naturalness that would have confounded the gossips of Caldwell's Fork if they had known about it, which they probably did, because nothing in a small frontier town was truly private. The whispers reached him at the general store in early November. August Friel, who was a decent man but also a realistic one, warned him that there were some in town who felt the situation was irregular and that he ought to either send the woman away or make things proper. Emmett listened to August Friel and thought about it on the ride home. That evening he said to Hazel, "There is talk in town." She was mending a tear in one of the burlap seed sacks by lamplight, her head bent over the needle and thread, and she did not look up immediately. "About us?" "Yes." "Of course there is," she said, still not looking up. "There always is." She took a stitch. "Does it bother you?" "It would bother me more if it affected your reputation," he said. "This is your life too. You have to live in this county." She set the sack down then and looked at him across the table. The lamp between them made the shadows warm and the light play in the auburn of her hair, and she had a look on her face that was deliberate and composed in the way she was when she had already thought something through and arrived at her position. "Emmett," she said, "what is it that you want?" He met her eyes. He had learned by now that with her, the only useful approach was the direct one. "I want you to stay," he said. "Not because of the farm and not because of the seeds and not because you know how to revive drought-damaged soil. Because I wake up every morning now and you are the first thought I have, and I go to sleep every night thinking about the way you look when you are explaining something you care about, and I have not felt like this in 11 years on this land, not once, and I am not interested in wasting what is left of the drought in pretending otherwise." Hazel Aldridge sat across the table from him with the lamplight on her face and her hands still, and her eyes the clear, steady green that he had memorized without knowing he was doing it, and the silence between his words and her response lasted exactly long enough to make his heart hammer. "I came to Texas with seeds and a plan," she said. "I did not come intending to fall in love with a stubborn rancher who refuses to leave a dying farm." "It's not dying anymore," he reminded her. "No," she agreed, and the smile came, the private one, the quiet one. "It's not." She reached across the table and put her hand over his. "Yes, Emmett, I want to stay, not because of the well or the land or the plans. Because you built me a rain catcher out of salvaged pipe and looked at the ground afterward as though it were the most ordinary thing in the world. Because you listen when I talk, and then you do what I've said, and then you improve it. Because you are the most decent and steady and altogether good man I have encountered, and because I have been trying very hard for 2 months not to notice that, and I have not been successful." He turned his hand over under hers and held it. "There is a minister in Caldwell's Fork," he said, "Reverend Cole. He comes through from Amarillo every 3rd Sunday." "The 3rd Sunday of November is 12 days away," she said. "I know it." She looked at him for a long moment. The fire in the cook stove was making its low, constant sound. The wind outside was moving across the plains in that vast and ancient way it had, indifferent to everything, and somehow beautiful in its indifference. 12 days is enough time, she said. He stood up from the table and she stood with him, and he held both her hands in his and looked at her face in the lamplight, and thought that whatever the drought had taken, the drought had also, in some fashion that defied ordinary logic, made room for this, had stripped everything back to the one essential source of water and left him standing there when she arrived, and that if this was what remaining looked like, then he would not have changed a single day of the 11 years. He kissed her then, finally, with a gentleness that surprised him in himself, and she kissed him back with a warmth that did not surprise him at all, because he had known for some time that Hazel Aldridge was entirely and specifically herself in all things, and that this, whatever it was, would be no different. They were married on the 3rd Sunday of November 1886 in the small white church that Reverend Alpheus Cole used when he was in Caldwell's Fork, which was a building that had originally been a grain storage structure and had been converted with good intentions and indifferent carpentry by the town's men 3 years previous. Reverend Cole was a large man with a white beard and a voice that had been trained to carry across open country, and he performed the ceremony with a straightforward solemnity that suited both of them better than any amount of theatrical flourish would have. Hazel wore her best dress, which was a dark blue wool, and she had pressed it the night before, and pinned her hair up with the care of someone who did not often have cause for ceremony, but who understood its importance when it came. She carried a small bunch of dried wildflowers that she had pressed in her notebook back in September, because fresh flowers were not available in November in the Panhandle. Emmett wore his good shirt and his best vest, and had polished his boots to a shine he was fairly certain they had never achieved before. He stood beside her at the front of the converted grain building with August Friel and his wife on one side as witnesses and Domingo Reyes and his family in the front row, and he looked at Hazel Aldridge, who was becoming Hazel Rhodes in the next several minutes, and felt something that had no name and did not need one. Jonas Whittaker was there, and 2 families from the north of the county that he barely knew but who had apparently heard about the dryland farming project and had taken an interest, and a woman named Clara Birch, who was the town's school teacher, and who had befriended Hazel in their visits to the store with the particular swiftness of 2 educated women finding each other in a place where that was not always easily done. When Reverend Cole asked the words and Emmett said his and Hazel said hers, there was in the room a feeling that small wedding parties in difficult times sometimes generate, a feeling that is not just celebration but something sturdier, something closer to collective determination, as though the people witnessing the thing are also renewing their own commitments to the idea that the future is worth building. Afterward, there was food. August Friel had contributed from the store, dried fruit and canned goods, and a jar of honey that he announced was the last of his personal supply, and was therefore to be treated with respect. Domingo Reyes' wife, a remarkable woman named Alma, had made tamales, which she had transported in a cloth-wrapped pot, and which were consumed with a rapidity that spoke entirely well of their quality. Hazel had made a cake the day before with the precious flour and dried apple and the cinnamon she had been saving, and it was not a beautiful cake, being somewhat lopsided, but it was very good. They drove home in the wagon in the late afternoon, married, and the land spread around them in its winter colors, the pale gold of the dried grass and the dark lines of the fence posts and the low lavender of the far horizon, and Hazel had her hand through his arm and her head leaning slightly against his shoulder. "Well," he said after a while. "Well," she agreed. "I should tell you," he said, "that I am not very experienced at this marriage. I was engaged once in Missouri before I came out here, but she chose a man in town and I came west instead, and that was the end of it." "I was never engaged," Hazel said. "There were men who were interested, but they were interested in a version of me that was quieter and less opinionated, and I was not willing to become her." "Good," Emmett said. "I like the version that is here. She smiled against his shoulder. "You are getting better at declarations." "I am a work in progress," he said. She laughed, and it was the full laugh, the real one, and it went out into the winter evening and was taken by the wind across the empty plain. And Emmett Rhodes drove his wife home to the farm that had survived the drought by the grace of one sweet well. And he felt for the first time in years that survival was not the ceiling of what was possible here, but only the floor. December and January passed in the way that winter months passed on the southern plains, in a succession of cold, clear days and periodic northern storms that drove the temperature down fast and covered the ground briefly in shallow snow that the wind redistributed before it had time to properly accumulate. The wheat was in the ground and invisible, doing whatever wheat did underground in winter, building root systems and storing energy against the coming of spring. Emmett had managed to acquire 12 more head of cattle in November, buying them cheap from a rancher near Amarillo who was liquidating and getting out of the business entirely. They were thin animals but sound, and between the black-eyed peas that had yielded a modest but real harvest in the fall and the careful rationing of the hay he had bought from the rail depot, he was keeping them alive and slowly improving their condition. Hazel had written to the County Agricultural Extension Office in Amarillo in October, describing the dryland farming methods she was employing and the specific varieties of seeds she was using, and had received back in December a letter of such cautious and bureaucratic surprise that it was nearly comical, the agricultural officer having apparently not expected to receive a detailed technical agricultural analysis from a woman on a small Panhandle ranch. She wrote back with additional information and did not comment on his evident surprise, because she had found that engaging with people's assumptions about her competence was a waste of energy better spent elsewhere. The agricultural officer sent a colleague to visit in January, a young man named Peter Walsh, who arrived on horseback from Amarillo with a notebook of his own and the slightly dazed expression of someone who had been expecting something different and was rapidly recalibrating. He spent the afternoon with Hazel going over the field preparations and the planting records and the water usage calculations, and he was respectful and genuinely interested, and he left with copies of her notes and what appeared to be a significantly revised understanding of what was possible in Panhandle agriculture. Life between Emmett and Hazel in those winter months was a thing of daily accumulation, of small moments building towards something that needed no dramatic announcement, because it was already obvious in the way they moved through their shared days. She still worked with her notebook and her seed inventory every morning. He still went to the well before dawn and drew the water and tended the animals and kept the fences and the buildings in repair. But now these two routines folded around each other in a way that felt complete, each absence felt by the other and each return noticed. He discovered that she had a habit of singing quietly when she was working and did not know she was doing it, old songs that she had learned from her mother, Methodist hymns and folk tunes from Ohio, and once, memorably, a bawdy-drinking song that she had apparently learned from her brother, and that she stopped abruptly mid-verse when she realized he was standing in the doorway, and the resulting color on her face was magnificent. She discovered that he was, beneath the taciturn exterior that the drought had carved into him, capable of a dry wit that emerged in unexpected moments, and that was all the funnier for being delivered without any change of expression. She also discovered that he had been, before the drought years, a reader, and that there were books in a wooden chest under the bed that he had not opened in 3 years because somewhere in the worst of it, reading had felt like something from another life. She took the books out of the chest one evening and stacked them on the shelf she had cleared for the purpose, and did not make any particular comment about it. And that night after supper, he picked one up and read for an hour, and she sat across from him with her mending and the warmth of the lamp between them, and it was one of the best evenings either of them could remember. February brought real rain. It came on a Tuesday night, slowly at first, a sound on the roof that Emmett woke to in the dark and lay listening to for a full minute before he was sure it was what he thought it was. He got up and went to the window, and the smell of it came in immediately, that ancient and overwhelming smell of water meeting dry ground, earth giving up its long-held breath. Hazel was awake too. She appeared beside him at the window, her hair loose around her shoulders, and they stood together and watched the rain come down in the dark, not a furious storm but a steady, persistent rain, the kind that actually soaks in rather than running off the packed dry earth in sheets. "How long has it been?" she asked, barely above a whisper, as though speaking too loudly might interrupt it. "Real rain," he said, "since April of '84. She took his hand in the dark. He held it tightly. It rained through the night and into the morning, and when the dawn came up pale and clean and the world outside was the color of something newly washed, Hazel put on her coat and boots and went outside, and he went with her, and they walked through the wet morning to the north field, where the winter wheat was in the ground, and they stood and looked at the mud, the actual dark mud where cracked earth had been the day before, and neither of them said anything for a long time. Then Emmett said, "It's going to be all right." And he meant the wheat, and he meant the ranch, and he meant everything he had almost lost, and he also meant something that had nothing to do with any of those things. "Yes," Hazel said, and she put her arm around his waist and leaned into him, and he put his arm around her shoulders, and they stood together in the wet north field of the Rhodes Ranch in the February morning of 1887, and watched the water soaking into the earth that they had prepared together to receive it. Spring arrived in a rush of green that felt almost violent after the long years of gold and brown and gray. The winter wheat came up in March in dense, healthy rows of the most extraordinary green Emmett had ever seen, a dark, waxy green that looked improbably vigorous in the Panhandle soil. And when Peter Walsh rode out from Amarillo again to look at it, he stood in the field with his hands on his hips and his mouth slightly open for a long moment before he said anything. "This is real," he said finally, as though he had needed to establish that first. "This is real," Hazel said, standing next to him with her arms crossed and the satisfaction of 6 months of work settled on her like something rightfully owned. "I need to write a report," Peter said. "I need to write a substantial report and send it to the state office. And I need to include everything you have given me, Miss Aldridge, Mrs. Rhodes, pardon me, and I would like your permission to publish some of your methodology in the Agricultural Extension Bulletin." "It's Mrs. Rhodes now," Hazel said with a small smile. "And you have my permission, provided you give accurate credit and include the Mennonite seed sources from Kansas, because those farmers deserve acknowledgement for the knowledge they brought." Peter Walsh wrote his report. It was published in the spring edition of the Texas Agricultural Extension Bulletin, and then reprinted in part by a newspaper in Amarillo, and it brought 3 separate sets of visitors to the Rhodes Ranch in April and May, farmers from neighboring counties who had heard about the Mennonite wheat and the dryland methods, and who came with the same combination of skepticism and desperate hope that Emmett himself had felt that August morning at the gate. Hazel received all of them. She walked them through the fields and showed them the soil preparation, and explained the seed varieties, and answered their questions with the same unhurried directness she brought to everything. And she sent them away with portions of seed and written instructions, because she had planned for this from the beginning, had sown the wheat fields with surplus enough to share. Emmett watched her with these visitors, and felt the thing he had identified in November on the drive home from Caldwell's Fork. That feeling that was the cousin of pride, but was also something more, something that was specifically about the extraordinary nature of the person he had married, and the enormous good fortune of having been standing at a gate that day in August when a woman with a wagon full of seeds came down the road. The wheat harvest came in June 1887, 6 weeks early according to the conventional Panhandle calendar, because the Mennonite variety matured faster than ordinary winter wheat. They cut it with a borrowed reaper, and a McCormick mower that Emmett had managed to acquire in April on credit from the implement dealer in Amarillo on the strength of the extension bulletin report. August Friel came out on the first day of cutting, and Domingo Reyes came with Raphael, and Jonas Whitaker came, and Clara Birch came, and there were 6 men Emmett barely knew who had heard about the harvest and showed up in the morning with work gloves and a willingness to help that he was not going to refuse. The harvest was not a bumper crop. It was not the yield of a fully established farm in a normal year. But it was 40 acres of actual wheat grown in drought-tested Panhandle soil with minimal irrigation from a single well, and when they calculated the bushels at the end of the 3rd day of cutting, it was more than enough to justify the enterprise. More than enough to sell a portion to August Friel for the store and keep seed stock for next year's planting and pay down the credit on the McCormick mower, and still have grain to mill for flour that would see the Rhodes household through the next 6 months. Standing in the cut field on the evening of the 3rd day, watching the last light go golden across the harvested rows, Emmett said, "You were right." Hazel was beside him with chaff in her hair and her face brown from the June sun, and her hands wrapped around a cup of the cool well water she had brought out in a pitcher. She looked at him. "I know," she said, and then she laughed at herself for saying it, and the laugh was the big genuine one, and it made him laugh too, standing there in the cut wheat field in the late June evening, which was something he had not done in a longer time than he could precisely calculate. He took the cup from her hand and drank the water, which was cold and sweet and exactly what it had always been, and handed it back, and she drank from the same cup, and they stood in the field they had built together and looked at what they had made. By the summer of 1887, the Rhodes ranch had changed in ways that were visible from the road. The north field was in grain stubble from the harvest, already being prepared for the next cycle. The eastern field had a second planting of cowpeas. The kitchen garden on the south side of the house was producing turnips and squash and sweet potatoes, with a reliability that made Hazel quietly triumphant every morning when she went to check it. The cattle herd had grown to 51 head, still modest but healthy now, their condition having improved steadily as the grazing land began to recover with the February rains and the careful rotational grazing system that Hazel had proposed and Emmett had implemented. The house had changed too. There was a proper shelf of books in the main room and a second lamp that Emmett had bought in Amarillo in April. There was a rocking chair on the porch that he had made over 3 evenings in March from timber he had milled from the dead cottonwood that had fallen along what had been the eastern creek bank. There was a kitchen garden that smelled of growing things in the morning. And in September of 1887, Hazel told him that she was expecting a child. She told him in the evening, sitting at the table with the lamplight between them, and she told him with a directness that was characteristically her own, but with a quality in her voice that was softer than her usual tone, a little less certain, as though this was the one place where her customary composure felt more vulnerable. Emmett was very still for a moment. Then he reached across the table and took her hand and held it. "Are you well?" he asked. It was the first thing because she was the first thing. "I am very well," she said, "tired in the mornings but otherwise entirely well." He looked at her and felt something moving in him that was too large for the room they were sitting in, something that expanded outward past the walls of the timber frame house and across the yard and out over the fields he had almost lost, and the well that had not run dry and the 40 acres of next year's wheat seed already in the ground. "I am going to be a father," he said, testing the words. "You are," she said. He brought her hand up and pressed it to his lips, and she let him. And when he looked at her again, her eyes were bright with something that might have been tears or might simply have been the extraordinary nature of the moment. "We are going to need to make the back room larger," he said. She laughed, and he heard the relief in it, the release of the small held breath she had been carrying in with her to this conversation, and it occurred to him that she had been uncertain about his response, despite all evidence to the contrary, because some vulnerabilities are not answered by logic. "We have time," she said. "Not as much as you think," he said and smiled, and the smile felt good on his face like something that fit there properly. The winter of 1887 into 1888 was busy in the way that winters on the plains can be when there is something living and growing in the house, not just in the fields. Hazel continued her work, because she was not a woman who stopped working for any ordinary reason, though she accepted Emmett's help with the heavier tasks without argument, which represented a notable compromise on her part. She continued her correspondence with Peter Walsh and with seed suppliers, and with the agricultural community that had grown up around her extension bulletin article. She received a letter in January from a woman in Kansas, a Mennonite farmer's wife named Margaret Friesen, who had read the article and wanted to share information about additional drought-resistant varieties she had been developing on her own farm. And this correspondence became one of the most valued of Hazel's professional relationships, carried on by letter across several hundred miles with a mutual respect that did not require geography. Emmett built the back room larger. He worked on it in December and January during the cold days when outdoor work was limited, framing out the addition with timber he had ordered from the lumber yard in Amarillo, properly milled and treated, because this addition was not going to be a rough and ready construction. It was going to be a room where someone was going to grow up. He took this seriously in a way that expressed itself in plumb walls and level floors, and a window on the east side that would let in the morning light. Their son was born in April of 1888, on a clear spring morning when the wind was gentle, and the wheat was already 4 inches out of the ground in the north field, and the eastern sky had the luminous quality it had on the best days, when it seemed to hold light rather than merely reflect it. He was a healthy, loud, fully determined child, who announced his arrival with a vigor that suggested he had inherited something from both parents, and the county doctor who attended was an elderly man named Dr. Sutton, who had delivered a great many babies in Taylor and Garza counties, and who declared with professional satisfaction that both mother and child were entirely sound. They named him James Aldridge Rhodes, for Hazel's father and for Emmett's middle name that he had never much used, and which now seemed to belong to someone else who deserved it more. James Rhodes arrived in a house that was, by any measure, a different place from the one his father had almost abandoned 2 years before. The back room was solid and warm. The shelf of books was full. The kitchen garden was established and confident. The north field was in its second year of Mennonite wheat, and the yield would be better than the first. The cattle herd had 63 head and was being managed with the rotational system that preserved the grazing land rather than exhausting it. And the well was still good, still cold and sweet and 40 feet deep, still giving what it had always given, unchanged in the way that the deepest things do not change. Emmett stood at the well on the morning after James was born, in the early light before anyone else was awake, and he drew up a bucket of water and he drank from it, and he looked at the land spreading away from him in the dawn, the fields and the pasture and the fence lines, and he thought about the morning 2 years ago when he had stood here alone and felt the hollow of everything that had been stripped away, and felt now the difference between those 2 mornings in his whole body, in his bones and his blood and the breath in his chest. He thought about a woman coming down a road with a wagon full of seeds, and he thought about looking at one good well and understanding that it was enough to begin from. He thought about what Hazel had said, standing at this well on her first morning, that simple and enormous truth. Then we start here. He set the bucket down and went back inside, where his wife was sleeping with their son in the warmth of the room they had made, and he sat in the chair beside them and watched the light come through the east window and felt the contentment of a man who has survived, and then, against all reasonable expectation, has built something worth surviving for. Autumn of 1888 brought the county's first cooperative seed exchange, which was Hazel's idea and Domingo Reyes's logistics. They organized it from the general store, with August Friel's blessing and considerable practical support, and it drew farmers from 4 surrounding counties who came to trade seeds and knowledge, and to hear Hazel speak about the methods she had been developing and refining over 2 years of panhandle practice. She stood in the back room of August Friel's store with James on her hip, 17 months old by then and enormously interested in everything. And she talked for 2 hours about soil and water and seed selection and the partnership between the two, and the room was full, standing full, and the attention was complete. Emmett sat near the back of the room and watched her, and thought that this was what she had come for, not just his well and his land, though those had been the necessary beginning, but this, the ability to bring what she knew into the hands of people who needed it, to be the bridge between the knowledge she had gathered from Cyrus Henderson and Margaret Freeson, and her own years of practice, and the farmers who were trying to survive in a land that demanded a more sophisticated approach than most of them had been taught. After the meeting, a woman came up to Emmett while Hazel was surrounded by farmers asking questions. The woman was about 50, with the practical dress and the direct manner of a long-time farm woman, and she said, "Your wife is the most knowledgeable agricultural person I have encountered in this state, including the men." "I know," Emmett said simply. "You must be very proud." He watched Hazel across the room, James on her hip, her other hand making one of her characteristic precise gestures as she explained something to a cluster of attentive farmers. "Every day," he said. The woman looked at him appraisingly and then nodded, as though something she had suspected had been confirmed. "Well," she said, "you have yourself a remarkable ranch." "I have myself a remarkable wife," he corrected. "The ranch just benefits accordingly." He saw the woman smile as she moved away, and he turned back to watching Hazel, who had at that moment looked across the room and found his eyes with hers, the green clear and warm even at that distance, and gave him a look that was entirely private and entirely theirs. The years that followed were years of accumulation and growth, each building on the last with the steady logic of things that have been properly established and are now fulfilling their nature. The wheat harvests improved. By 1890, the Rhodes North Field was producing yields that would not have seemed possible in 1886. And 2 neighboring farms that had adopted Hazel's methods were producing comparable results. The cooperative seed exchange became an annual event and then a semi-annual one, and it drew the attention of the State Agricultural Office in Austin, which sent an official representative in 1891 who spent 3 days on the property and left with a report that eventually influenced the distribution of drought-resistant seed varieties through the state extension system. The cattle operation expanded carefully, always within the capacity of the land to support it, because Hazel had from the beginning been firm about the relationship between herd size and grazing land, and Emmett had learned early enough that her firmness on these matters was not stubbornness but knowledge, and he trusted her knowledge the way he trusted the well, because both had been proven. James grew. He grew with his mother's green eyes and his father's dark hair, and a combined stubbornness that was occasionally breathtaking in a child. And he showed from very early an interest in the soil, and the seeds that his mother cultivated with delight, and his father with the quiet wonder of a man who had not previously thought much about the things he might pass on. By the time he was 4, James could name a dozen seed varieties and could tell a healthy pea shoot from an unhealthy one at a glance, which was a skill that made August Friel, on one of his visits to the ranch, laugh until his eyes watered. In 1891, Hazel had a second child, a daughter they named Clara, for the schoolteacher who had been Hazel's first real friend in Caldwell's Fork, and who had continued that friendship over years of Sunday visits and letter correspondence and an unwavering mutual respect. Clara Rhodes arrived in November, in the same room where James had been born in the same warmth, and she was, from the beginning, a child who watched everything from her dark eyes with an attention that reminded Emmett entirely of her mother. Domingo Reyes's family thrived. The methods Hazel had shared and refined with them over the years had made their operation stable in a way it had not been before, and Raphael Reyes had married a young woman named Esperanza from a family further south, and the Reyes land that had survived so much dispossession and displacement was now beginning to look like something that would last for generations, which was all any family on the plains had ever truly wanted. Jonas Whitaker's farm had recovered and expanded, and Jonas himself had become one of the loudest advocates for the seed exchange, with the particular enthusiasm of a man who remembers clearly where he was before a good thing arrived and is not about to forget the contrast. August Friel's general store had flour from local grain. That simple fact, which had seemed an impossibility in the summer of 1886, was by 1891 simply the way things were. In the spring of 1892, on a morning in May when the North Field was coming up green with its sixth season of Mennonite wheat, and the pea fields were in blossom, and the cattle were grazing the rotational pasture, and James was 4 years old and running between the fence posts with the boundless energy of a child who has grown up outdoors, Emmett found Hazel standing at the well. She was not drawing water. She was simply standing there with her hand on the wooden housing the way she had stood on her first morning, and he stopped at the corner of the house and watched her for a moment. She turned as though she had heard him, though he had been quiet, and she smiled, and it was the private smile, the quiet one that he had been seeing for 6 years and that had not once diminished in its effect on him. He walked to her and stood beside her and put his arm around her shoulders. "Thinking," he said. "Remembering," she said. "I stood here on my first morning and I thought, this is enough to begin from, just this. One well in all this dry earth. And now," he said, she looked at the fields, the peas, the wheat, the kitchen garden, the cattle in the distance, the house with the addition and the porch and the rocking chair and the books on the shelf. She looked at James running between the fence posts, his dark hair flying, his mother's eyes bright. "Now I think, look what we made from it." He pulled her close and she leaned into him, and they stood at the well that had not run dry, that had been the one thing the drought had not taken, the single source from which everything else had been drawn. The morning was clear, and the air smelled of growing things, and the wind moved across the wheat field in a wave that traveled the full length of the north pasture before it found the fence line. "You know," she said, "Margaret Friesen wrote that she has a new variety from relatives in Ukraine. Cold hardy and drought resistant more than what we currently have. She wants to send some for us to trial here." "Of course she does," Emmett said, "and you want to try it." "I do." She tilted her head to look up at him. "The north half of the far east field, I've been thinking about the soil conditions." "You have been thinking about the soil conditions in the far east field while you were asleep this morning?" "Yes." He looked at her with the expression he had been developing over 6 years specifically for these moments, when her mind had been solving agricultural problems in the small hours while he slept, and which expression combined something like exasperation and something like absolute devotion in approximately equal measure. "What would you like me to do?" he said. "Prepare the seedbed," she said. "I'll tell you exactly how." "You always do," he said, and kissed the top of her head. James crashed to a stop against his father's legs, breathless and grinning, holding up a pebble of white quartz he had found near the fence post with the seriousness of someone presenting a significant discovery. Emmett hunkered down and examined the pebble with the appropriate gravity. "Good find," he said. "Mama," James said, turning to Hazel with the pebble, "is this limestone?" Hazel examined it with equal seriousness. "It's quartz, sweetheart. See how it's clear in the middle?" James looked at it with narrowed eyes. "Can we test the soil near where I found it?" Hazel met Emmett's eyes over their son's head, and the look between them was brief and complete, and contained 6 years of everything they had built in a single warm exchange. "Yes," she said. "Get your little shovel. I'll come with you." She followed James toward the fence line, the boy running ahead with the white pebble in his fist, and Emmett stood at the well and watched them go. The woman who had arrived at his gate with seeds and a plan and nothing much more, and the boy who had arrived afterward as the proof of everything, and the land spread around them green and alive, and full of what could be grown here if you knew how to listen to it. He reached out and put his hand on the wooden housing of the well, the same gesture he had seen her make on her first morning and that he had never forgotten, and he felt the solid wood under his palm, sun-warmed and real. Everything had almost ended here. The cattle, the wheat, the hope of any future at all. He had stood in this yard in the white summer heat of 1886 and felt the ground giving way under everything he had tried to build. And the only thing that had not given way was this, the water 40 feet below him, cold and sweet and patient in the dark. And then a wagon had come down the road, and a woman with green eyes and a straw hat had stopped at his gate. He had shown her the well because she had asked to see it, and she had pressed her palm to its housing the way you touch a living thing, and she had said simply, "Then we start here." And they had. And the thing they had started here had grown outward from that point in every direction, through prepared soil and planted seed and careful water and stubborn persistence, and the particular intelligence Hazel brought to every problem she had ever encountered, and through love, which was its own kind of stubborn persistence, its own refusal to let the ground stay barren, its own insistence on returning to the source and beginning again. Emmett Rhodes stood at his well in the spring morning of 1892, with his wife walking ahead of him toward the fence line with their son, with his daughter sleeping in the house behind him, with 6 years of harvest behind and the east field ahead, and Margaret Friesen's new Ukrainian wheat seed coming by post in the autumn. And he understood with the full weight and clarity of a man who has survived something, and then built something, and then loved something, and then watched all three of those things grow together into a life worth the living that there was not, in all the wide Panhandle country under the blue Texas sky, a single thing he would have changed. He looked at the well. He looked at the fields. He looked at Hazel crouching beside James in the grass by the fence post, her hand in the soil, showing him what to look for. He picked up the bucket. He drew up the water. He carried it to the trough where the horses drank, the same as he had done every morning since the drought began and every morning since it ended, and the water was cold and sweet and it did not run out, and the day began.